and welcome. This week is the 16th Sunday or weekend of the year. We're looking again at what is known as the C cycle, which is the Lucan cycle. And therefore, the gospel, of course, comes from the tradition of Luke, this time chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. The first reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 10a, and the second reading comes from the letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verses 24 through 28. One of the characteristics that is certainly very important, and we have been noticing it now over the last couple of weeks in looking at the Lucan story, is the quality of, or the characteristic of, hospitality. Hospitality in the first century world, both within Judaism but also within the culture of the Mediterranean, was a very important characteristic of how one dealt with not only one's own neighbors, but also how one dealt with those who were the outsiders. You'll remember that last time the gospel told the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, one that we, of course, were most familiar with, and that the Samaritan had shown considerable hospitality to the victim, to the man who had been left, remember, half dead, had bound up his wounds, had taken him to an inn, had provided for his staying, and had even promised that when, that is, the traveler, being the Samaritan, would return, he would pay whatever bill the victim had run up. So characteristically, it's a wonderful story of hospitality. In this case, the question posed had been, who is my neighbor? And when the questioner had been given the question back again by Jesus, who was neighbor, had said the one who had shown him, well, compassion, had shown him concern, but it truly extended hospitality. Now, the first reading this time, and it will be the first, we will notice this again next in our next week's celebration, is a story involving the patriarch and his wife, namely Abraham and Sarah. It pictures the story in which this couple welcome into their home 3 strangers. Now, hospitality, of course, you remember, provided safe passage often through dangerous territory. And so travelers, when they made their route, ran against that possibility that maybe they would not find safety and could come to harm. On the other hand, by the way, travelers were sometimes considered to be devious characters. What exactly were the travelers all about? See, I mean, there's always, as we pointed out, often 2 sides to a story. So when a traveler came into your house or your village, what exactly was or were their purposes? So what happens is, and some have pointed this out, a kind of 3-stage little process. First, so when you came to a place now where you had a potential host, in this case it would be Abraham and Sarah, although in a patriarchal society it generally was the man or the patriarch who did the kind of invitation and did the work, where the matriarch, that is the wife, was somewhat behind the scenes, although it depended, again, upon the particular account. So, this 3-stage development, first, the host would attest the stranger as best he could to determine whether or not to allow the stranger into the household. In this case, there are 3, and the number 3, of course, has various implications as to what this is all about. So having tested, then the second thing is the host determined whether to transform the strangers into guests. See, and that was what hospitality did. You no longer remained a kind of outsider or one unknown, but now you became one almost like the family. And so the third stage was that the host and the guest, when this whole process ended, would leave as friends. Now that's the general kind of process that went on with regard to hospitality in the ancient world. Abraham here invites these strangers into his household. Therefore, he kind of does all of the things that we have mentioned, and serves the strangers, now provides them. We don't know who they are. They are unnamed. Abraham is named, but not the visitors. Serves them some would point out, a rather unkosher meal. Now, keep in mind, this is the story of Abraham, who was the father of the Jewish experience, but in his day, those kosher rules were not so much in effect as they later would be. So what does he serve him? Well, he serves him meat, a steer, that would be, I guess you would say beef, curds, and milk. Now, why do I say this is kosher? Because in those days, in Jewish community, you don't mix meat with dairy products or dairy results. It would have taken a little bit of time for this. First of all, Abraham tells his servant to go take this steer. You would have to obviously slaughter it, prepare it, get it ready to be roasted. All of this does not happen just like that. And so the visitors would have been with Abraham for some period of time. Now, the narration doesn't go into that, but you think about that. Abraham tells his wife to get other things ready for the food. So we're not sure, just how long it would take to butcher and prepare this meat. But anyway, what Abraham serves to the guest is a far cry from snack food. It's a real wonderful meal with careful preparation. Now, the visitors, having had this meal, and we're not quite sure what the dialogue is that goes on between Abraham and the visitors, before they leave, ask about Sarah. Now, keep in mind, as I've mentioned, usually the women, there would be in the great tent in which this, of course, is the kind of household in which Abraham is living, pictured as living, would have been a kind of veil or curtain which kept the women from the men. Now, obviously, the women could move close to the curtain and listen to what was going on. And I don't mean that in any unkind way, but they wanted to know what the hubby was kind of doing and what he was saying. Now the visitors ask about Sarah. Technically, guests had no right to personal family information. So the fact, now it sounds very pleasant today, we would say, how's your wife doing? How's the family? Did not work in this kind of culture. So you did not ask questions like that. Abraham, however, responds without hesitation to the question. This, again, is a certain break of etiquette that was there. And it is at this point that the guests say to Abraham that Sarah will bear a son. Now, this is very interesting. We do know that up to this point, Abraham and Sarah had been unable to have children. Abraham has a slave wife named Hagar, and that's all part of the ritual that we do know something about Abraham at this point, but says, when I return, when we return, the three of them, next time, Sarah will be with child. It's interesting that Sarah is pictured as laughing, probably because the information, she was perhaps even at this point a bit beyond childbearing stage, but nevertheless would be a mother. So all of that, and not only that she would bear a child, but that the child would be a son. You know, we would just take that for granted, oh, he's going to have a son. Well, how do you know that? Because in those days, and even today, you really sometimes do not know until the offspring is born what gender it is. But here, the information given by the stranger is that it will be a son, and this will be very important for the posterity of Abraham in carrying on his line and in his family. So this is a marvel. This first account, therefore, from the book of Genesis is offered today as an example of hospitality, and that in fact they not only leave as friends at this point, but also that the visitors, the guests, promise to Abraham a wonderful reward for his generosity. Now that isn't always the way it works, but in this case it does. We come now to the gospel. You remember, mentioned at the beginning here, that the hospitality of the Samaritan was where the story ended. It is picked up now by the visit of Jesus to the home of a woman named Martha and her sister Mary. Now, Martha and Mary are, of course, mentioned here in the Lucan account, and they are also mentioned, and we're going to look a little bit at this as we go along today, in the gospel tradition according to John, in which not only do we know that Martha and Mary are sisters, but also that they have a brother, Lazarus. Now, he is not mentioned here at all in the Lucan account. The fact that Martha invites Jesus into her home is interesting. The suggestion that Luke is saying is that the home is owned by, or the household is owned by Martha, which would be not impossible, but interesting. And as this story unfolds, it is part of a technique that often Luke likes to use when he tells a story that revolves around a man. He often likes to tell a complementary story that revolves around a woman. In this case, it would be Martha. It is a kind of dynamic of the third gospel to see often this kind of relationship. Something which intrigues a man, something which intrigues a woman. So just as a little aside. In this story, and of course many people are most familiar with this story, and in this account, Martha is pictured as preparing a meal for the visitor, Jesus. Mary, her sister, is pictured as sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening. Now, this Mary, by the way, is the sister of Martha. This is not Mary Magdalene. Later on, because apparently the tradition thought that maybe there were too many, I smile a little, too many Marys, tended to put all of the Marys together in a single person. But that's not the case. We don't know a whole lot about this Mary at this point, although later on, when it comes to the table story of Lazarus, where Martha is pictured again as serving and Mary is also present, does anoint Jesus with oil. So there is an action there, but that does not happen in this account. In this account, Martha is preparing the meal, and at one point she says to Jesus, look, would you please ask or tell, she doesn't even say please in a certain way, tell my sister to help me with the process of getting this meal ready. And Jesus, interestingly here, and he does this on other occasions, Jesus refuses to interfere in a domestic squabble, because what he is being asked to do is to side either with Martha or to Mary, and he wisely does not do this. You think about this, it indeed shows again the practicalness that Jesus often shows in Luke's story of not getting involved in family affairs such as this, because inevitably you choose one side or the other, you can't win. So Jesus kind of stays out of this. And then he says, Mary has chosen the better part. Now there's a great deal of ambiguity here. What exactly is the better part that Mary has chosen? And of course, this is where interpreters, reflectors on this story have often, if you think about it, painted Martha in a kind of negative way and Mary in a more positive way. And that tradition has often come down to the way in which this account has been interpreted. Now, it is true to sit at the feet of someone, in this case, Mary, to sit at the feet of Jesus, does exercise the role of a disciple. But it is not true to say that Martha is not a disciple also, because when we think about it, being and showing hospitality is not simply saying I'll be hospitable, but it is doing something. Someone has to prepare the meal. Critics could point out that if Martha had also sat at the feet of Jesus, they probably would have gone without supper, because who would have done this? See, so the practicality is that Martha exercises the role of hostess, see, hospitality, host, welcoming Jesus. And one assumes, by the way, that it isn't just Jesus who is invited here, but also his disciples. Now, they are pictured as accompanying Jesus, but they're not specifically mentioned in this particular account. In a certain way, this story has parabolic overtones, much like the Good Samaritan was a parable. Now, these are real friends of Jesus, and we know they're friends of Jesus, and we have to bring into account here John's insights, that you remember, and it's important to get a good image here of what's going on, that you remember that in John's gospel, he is with his disciples when news comes that Lazarus is sick. And Jesus really delays going. He gets another, and finally Jesus says, oh, Lazarus has died, let us go. And Thomas says, wait a minute, we mentioned this before, says to Jesus, they're out to get you, you don't want to do this. Jesus sets that aside and goes. Now, as he comes to the place where Martha and Mary are, and in John's gospel, they are in the place called Bethany. Bethany is about 2 miles outside of the city of Jerusalem, which, according to this gospel, would make them close to the important city. Now, in Luke's story, he doesn't need that information, apparently. But here's the point to notice about Martha. As Jesus approaches where Martha and Mary live, Martha goes out to meet Jesus, while Mary stays at home. When Martha encounters Jesus, she greets him and says to him, if, Jesus, you had been here, my brother would not have died. Well, Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And Martha says, yes, I know, on the last day. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. Do you believe this? And Martha says, yes. Martha makes a wonderful profession of faith here. Now, this is in the Johannine tradition. Mary, on the other hand, finally comes also when she hears that Jesus is approaching, and she says a similar thing to Jesus, that if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But then they all go together to the place where Lazarus is. Now, I mention all of this because it does give a little different picture of Martha. Martha is not simply engaged in activities that do not require faith, that do not require attention to Jesus. Now, if there is a point here that perhaps Luke is wanting to say is, when Jesus comes as the visitor, they as the hosts. Now, in a certain way, both Martha and Mary are the hostesses welcoming Jesus into their home. Do each of them do it in a different way? Well, yes. Is one showing more attention to Jesus than the other? Well, Mary is sitting and listening to what Jesus has to say. Martha is busy. Obviously, if you're preparing things in the kitchen or wherever you would go about the process of getting the meal ready, you wouldn't have the opportunity to sit and listen as Mary does. So in that sense, Mary is giving more attention to Jesus than is Martha. But in another sense, getting the meal ready, getting things prepared for the celebration, is also giving attention to Jesus. So all of this brings us back again to the question, what is the better part? Is it that Martha is more verbal, outgoing, and critical? When you look at her characteristic, Mary is more silent, traditionally more introspective. Well, that's one way to look at the two women. Yes, they are sisters, but yes, they have different qualities and different characteristics. Luke, by the way, has an interest in women patrons. Now, I mention this because we have a little bit of an opportunity to reflect on this. Sometimes the Gospel of Luke is considered to be a gospel of women, and although women do and are available for incidences in Jesus' story in this gospel more than others, to say, however, that Luke necessarily always includes women in his understanding of Jesus' mission overlooks the fact that it was still a patriarchal society. And that although women could be patrons, now why do I mention this? Means that they had the material goods to, well, in this case, Mary, or Martha rather, to run a home. Obviously, you had to have some resources for this to occur. Now, we don't know where she got this goods, how, that is wealth, what her resources were. But she, like men in Jesus' entourage, places this at the service of Jesus and his mission. You remember that throughout this gospel, they are pictured as women as part of the entourage that follows with Jesus as he makes his mission. So, yes, they are part of the mission of Jesus. Now, what's the role of a disciple? Well, certainly the role of a disciple is not simply to listen. See, so to say that Mary sits at the feet of Jesus and listens, but it is also to ask questions, to be actively involved in the process of learning. Is Mary doing that? Well, at least as the narration unfolds, does not seem to be the case. Martha, on the other hand, although she is not actively listening, is certainly actively doing things to make the meal, to make the occasion certainly what it needs to be. Jesus had, and just to backtrack a little bit here, remember that Martha says to Jesus, "Do you not care?" Now, isn't that an interesting challenge that is presented to Jesus? That is he unaware of all that needs to go on for a meal to be prepared? Is he not sensitive to the fact that maybe Martha would like to sit with Mary and not have to do all of this activity? Or does he realize that Martha's personality is, and you notice that Luke, who is always very practical in his presentation of things, is practical with regard to Martha. She's one who wants to make sure that everything works well. Is that a bad thing? How many of those of you who may be watching this will sympathize with Martha? Yeah, when you invite someone to dinner, it's expected that you will take care of the necessities of being a good host or hostess, and you can't expect the host, the guest rather, to do this. And maybe you do expect the rest of the family to help out. Those of you who have prepared Thanksgiving dinners will know just how important this is. You invite guests, yes, and you want to listen to what they have to say, but somebody has to make sure that everything works very well. So although Martha sometimes comes out on the short, as the interpreters do, of the short end of this, I might suggest that she is also a good disciple, but is unable, for the important reasons of getting things ready, to do this. But her question, see, that gets a little bit edgy. Do you not care that she is not helping here? Again, as I mentioned earlier, she's forcing Jesus into a position where he's going to have to say, Martha, all right, Mary, maybe you should help out. But he doesn't do this. So again, the question that we raised a few minutes ago, what is the better part that Mary has chosen? And it's really not clear. See, it ends, and that's why I say sometimes this has a parablitic attitude toward it. Remember that good parables end with often a question, not with an answer. And so when Jesus says, Mary has chosen the better part, it may not end like it's a question, but the text ends there. Well, what is this better part? What is it that Mary is doing that Martha is not doing? And in conclusion, it probably would be fair enough to say that as Luke sees it, when you bring a guest into your home, that guest should be the center of your attention. Now, just exactly how you do that, well, that of course raises a number of other possibilities as well as a number of other questions. But I would suggest, as we hear this story this time, not to make it an either or, a Martha or a Mary, as sometimes this story has been told, but as a both and. That to be a good disciple is to both be attentive to the things that need to be done, like Martha, but to be listening and attentive, as is Mary. And when we perhaps gather together, those two qualities importantly balance one another off or out. To be listening, to be active. It's Martha and Mary. There's a little bit, says Luke when he presents the story, of each of them in our lives and in our hearts. So this time, may truly we appreciate the service and goodness that Martha presents, the listening and attentiveness that Mary presents, and seek to bring those two qualities into our approach to Jesus and to our faith. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.